Imagine a future where the luxuries we take for granted, clean water, reliable food, a stable economy, are things of the past. According to MIT, this isn't just a sci-fi scenario, it's a very real possibility that could play out by 2040. In the 1970s, researchers used cutting-edge technology to forecast what would happen if we kept living and consuming as we do today. And now, their predictions are aligning with reality in some unsettling ways. So, what does this mean for us? Could society as we know it really collapse? Or can human innovation pull us back from the brink? Stick around as we dive deep into MIT's Limits to Growth report and what it spells out for our future. In the early 1970s, MIT researchers predicted that society could collapse by 2040. For the past 10,000 years, human civilizations have risen and fallen, leaving behind remnants of their glory, ruins, artifacts, and fading memories. The reasons behind these collapses vary, but they usually fall into four categories: political, social, environmental, and, most relevant to us, economic. History shows that no civilization is immune. From the rapid destruction of Pompeii in a single volcanic eruption to the fall of the mighty Roman Empire over centuries, the common thread is clear: no empire lasts forever. Today, we are wealthier, more connected, and more advanced than any society in history. If you're watching this video, you have access to the internet, something even the wealthiest kings of the past couldn't dream of. Think about it. Our daily lives are filled with conveniences like instant communication, global travel, and food delivery apps. Yet these luxuries would have been unimaginable a century ago. We take for granted things like safe drinking water, climate-controlled homes, and immediate access to information. In the grand scheme of history, even the richest figures like Rockefeller or Mansa Musa couldn't touch what the average person has today. Now, a question that always comes up: who is the richest person of all time? Elon Musk? Maybe, depending on when you watch this video. But here's the truth. While historic figures like Rockefeller or the Rothschilds were wealthy for their era, they still lived in a time when global poverty was the norm. If I had to choose between a modern two-bedroom apartment with Wi-Fi, air conditioning, and running water versus a sprawling 15th century palace with no plumbing and food that could make me sick, I'd choose the apartment every single time, and you should too. Despite what you might think from headlines and social media, the world today is more interconnected and cooperative than ever. Even nations with long-standing rivalries depend on each other economically, creating a stability that would have been unthinkable in the days of Napoleon. But here's the catch. Our modern world is like a jet engine, faster and more powerful than any ancient civilization, but far more fragile. One small issue in the system could lead to a chain reaction of problems. And the faster you go, the harder the crash when things go wrong. Let's be honest, most of us today wouldn't last very long without easy access to food or a grocery delivery app at our fingertips. But don't worry, I'm not turning into one of those doomsday preppers yelling about the apocalypse. Instead, let's dig into how MIT predicted society might collapse and what that really means for us. So how exactly did MIT forecast the downfall of civilization? What indicators were they looking at to determine whether we're on the right path toward disaster? And more importantly, since the report claims we're ahead of schedule, should we really be worried? Or is this just a case of reading too much into statistical trends? MIT's famous study, The Limits to Growth, set out to determine whether the way we use the world's resources was sustainable. Spoiler, it wasn't. This study was groundbreaking because it was one of the first to use computers and system dynamics to model the global economy. Now, I'm no computer scientist, but here's the gist. System dynamics is a tool that tries to simulate complex real-world systems in a digital environment. Think of it as a software-based crystal ball. Today, that sounds routine, but remember, this was happening back in the 60s and 70s when computers were the size of rooms and had less power than the phone you're holding. Still, the MIT team managed to create a program called World 3, which modeled everything from population growth to industrial output, and most importantly, how these factors interact. For instance, a booming population demands more resources, more food, water, housing, and energy. But a larger population can also spark more innovation. With 8 billion people on the planet today, the odds of that are much higher than they were 100 years ago, when the global population was just 2 billion. Predicting the future of an economy is like trying to hit a moving target. There are countless variables, and they're all interconnected. This is where MIT's World 3 program comes in. It wasn't just trying to predict one or two things. It modeled everything from birth rates to farming technology. The core idea was that all these variables are critical to maintaining our modern lifestyles, but they interact in ways that can create feedback loops. Take declining birth rates, for example. Fewer babies mean an aging population. As the population ages, younger workers face more financial pressure to care for the elderly, either directly at home or indirectly through higher taxes for pensions and healthcare. This added pressure makes it harder for younger people to start their own families, which causes, even lower birth rates. That's a feedback loop in action, and it's exactly the kind of scenario World 3 was designed to model. The MIT study was tracking hundreds of variables, but they focused on 5 key ones: population, industrial output, food production, available resources, and pollution. Keep in mind, this report came out in 1972, long before climate change was the pressing issue it is today. Still, these 5 variables were and are critical to understanding how economies function, and even more important is how they interact with each other. Let's play with a hypothetical for a second. Imagine a world where everything stays the same except for food production and population. These 2 variables are obviously linked. If one changes, the other will too. But which scenario sounds scarier to you? A declining population leading to lower food production? Or food shortages leading to a shrinking population? Yeah, those are 2 very different crises, and they illustrate just how important these interactions are. Predicting the future with absolute certainty? That's a fool's game. The researchers ran multiple simulations, each one with different assumptions about how the future might unfold. In some scenarios, they assumed innovation would continue at a steady rate. Worker productivity would keep improving like it has in recent decades. In others, they imagined a future where technological innovation compounds rapidly, opening up possibilities like harvesting resources from asteroids or growing food in labs. And in some models, they even considered the chance that technological progress would plateau. Now, the idea of a tech plateau may sound unrealistic to us, especially when we've grown up in an era of constant innovation. Take Moore's Law, for example. Computing power has doubled every 2 years for the last 5 decades. But we're starting to hit the physical limits of how many transistors can fit on a microchip. Sure, quantum computing might come to the rescue, offering even more computing power, but it's not a guarantee. Meanwhile, a lot of innovation today seems to focus on getting us to consume more ad contents. Anyway, technology wasn't the only variable the researchers tweaked. They also ran models with different assumptions about birth rates, recycling efforts, resource discoveries, and levels of global trade. The goal was to account for every realistic combination of factors in their economic models. After running countless simulations, they averaged out the trajectories of 5 key variables to predict where humanity might end up. Unsurprisingly, the results varied, but they all had one thing in common: a significant decline. Of course, the researchers couldn't address every possible outcome in detail, but they focused on a few key scenarios that consistently fell within the standard deviation of their simulations. One of the most optimistic outcomes. They called it the comprehensive technology scenario. In this scenario, we continue living much like we do today, but technological progress accelerates enough to keep up with the growing demand for food, housing, and other essentials. Yes, food production takes a hit, mainly because of pollution in waterways and the misuse of arable land. But in this model, technological advances help us work around those issues. Population growth starts to plateau around 2040, not because of mass starvation, but due to the natural tendency for wealthier, more urban societies to have fewer children. Interestingly, industrial output peaks and then declines in this model. Normally, that would signal lower living standards. But here's the catch. We'd be using our resources so efficiently that overall quality of life wouldn't drop. It might even improve. Imagine if tomorrow, self-driving cars became a reality. Suddenly, the need for individual car ownership would plummet. Industrial output would likely fall, but would that make us poorer? Not really. Instead, A car that used to serve one household could now be efficiently shared among dozens of people. This is exactly what the World Economic Forum was hinting at when they famously said, "You will own nothing and be happy about it." Now, whether they didn't think through how to explain that idea to the public or they just enjoy stirring up controversy is up for debate. But the point is, a more efficient use of resources would reduce pollution and help ensure that we don't completely deplete raw materials. It wouldn't be a terrible outcome. We just might not see the same insane exponential growth in living standards we've become used to over the past century. But hey, it's not societal collapse either. If banking on some future technological miracle doesn't sound like your idea of a good time, don't worry. The researchers behind this report had a backup plan. It's called the stabilized world scenario. This model assumes that innovation continues at today's pace, but we also invest heavily in renewable energy and recycling. Remember, this study was done before climate change was a major focus, so when they talked about renewables and recycling, they were thinking about resource depletion and local pollution, not the broader climate issues we face today. In many ways, this stabilized scenario looks a lot like the comprehensive technology scenario we talked about earlier. The big difference is that this version assumes we voluntarily slow down industrial output before it leads to problems like food shortages and out-of-control pollution. Out of all the models and scenarios the researchers ran, this one was identified as the most optimistic, barring any unforeseen technological breakthrough that could radically change how we manage resources and run economies. And hey, maybe that breakthrough will come, but planning for a technology that doesn't exist yet is tricky, unless you want to make a spiritual sacrifice to Daddy Elon. Couldn't hurt, right? Now for the bad news. While this optimistic scenario looked like something we could realistically work toward back in 1972, the timeline doesn't quite match where we are today. Fast forward to the 2021 follow-up study by Gaia Harrington, and it turns out the path we're on right now actually fits the business as usual 2 scenario from the original report. And that's not good. In this model, pollution continues to rise exponentially, and recycling never becomes economically viable or widespread enough to make a real difference. Industrial output does peak at a higher level than in other scenarios, but that's where the good news ends. Food production plummets, birth rates drop sharply in wealthy countries, and poorer countries face famine. As the young population shrinks, there are fewer workers to sustain industrial output, leading to an overall decline in economic prosperity. At the same time, easily accessible resources dry up, pushing us further into economic decline. By all accounts, this is what you'd call a full-scale collapse of society. I mentioned earlier that I'd rather be a middle-class worker today than a king 150 years ago. But if the business-as-usual model holds, I might prefer being middle-class today over being a king just 20 years from now. That's a scary thought, but before we panic, let's consider the criticisms. Best case, it's all overblown. Worst case, well, maybe it's time to learn how to forage. Of course, any report predicting collapse is bound to attract skeptics. Some critics argue that the data tracking the business-as-usual predictions too closely is troubling. Others believe the study underestimates human innovation, noting that necessity sparks invention, like the recent rise in renewable technologies. We still have areas to improve, like waste management, but we're miles ahead of where we were a decade ago. So, what's my take? I won't make bold predictions here. I encourage you to dive into these reports yourself. While I hope for the best, it's clear this research carries weight, backed by top economists and validated by recent follow-up studies. If this journey into the MIT Limits to Growth report has sparked new questions about our future, or even challenged your perspective on where we're headed, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let's keep digging into the big questions and exploring what's next, together. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.